Welcome guys to my channel. Make sure you support by liking as well as subscribing if you haven't subscribed. Okay, so in this video we're going to look at the ventricles or the brain. Okay, so we'll talk about the function of these ventricles, and then we'll also talk about the anatomic position, and that's what is important guys. This is anatomy. Okay, so let's start with the function of these ventricles of the brain. So in terms of the function, the ventricles of the brain, they basically produce cerebrospinal fluid. So they consist of colloid plexus. So this plexus is basically lined by ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells, they secrete cerebrospinal fluid. And once the cerebrospinal fluid is produced, it will be basically drained into the subarachnoid space by single midline as well as the paired lateral apertures of the fourth ventricle. Okay, so now let's talk about the anatomic position of these ventricles. So anatomically, the ventricles of the brain, they are divided into four. Okay, so we have the first two, they are called the lateral ventricle. Okay, then we have the third ventricle, okay, which is here. So these two in lady, they are called lateral ventricle. Okay, and then this is our third ventricle, and finally we have our fourth ventricle here. Okay, so let's start with the lateral ventricle. So in terms of the shape, the lateral ventricle, they present a C-shaped structure. Okay, so they form a C-shaped structure. That's how they present. Okay, then in terms of the position, the lateral ventricle, they lie on each side of cerebral hemisphere, on each side of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, then these two ventricles, they are separated from each other by septum pellucidum. So the septum pellucidum separates the two lateral ventricles from each other. Excuse. So in terms of the connection, so the lateral ventricle, they are connected to the third ventricle via interventricular foramen. So interventricular foramen basically connect the third and the lateral ventricle. Okay, so once the lateral ventricle secretes the cerebrospinal fluid, it will be then eventually drained into the third ventricle via interventricular foramen. Okay, now let's talk about the third ventricle. So the third ventricle, in terms of the position, it lies between the right and left halves of diencephalon. Okay, and it communicates with the fourth ventricle via cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so it communicates with the fourth ventricle via cerebral aqueduct. Okay, now let's come over here and talk about the last ventricle, which is basically your fourth ventricle. So the fourth ventricle, in terms of the position, it lies on the most posterior aspect of the pons and medulla. Okay, and then inferiorly it continues with the central canal. Okay, remember what we said? We said the ventricles of the brain, once they produce cerebrospinal fluid, they will need to secrete that cerebrospinal fluid until it reach the subarachnoid space. So this is the fourth ventricle is the one which is responsible for secreting the cerebrospinal fluid until it reaches the subarachnoid space. Okay, so we're going to dig a little bit in details once we talk about the secretion and absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. So in the next video we'll talk about it. Till next time.